I love it. I love it. I love it. All right. We are going to roll right into our next facilitated session before lunch. And this session is about advocating for police reform through effective policy solutions. And I can't think of a better person to put this one together for you all. You are in for a treat. Dr. Rashawn Ray will be presenting this session. And we got to do the bio because I don't think y'all understand. I just told Dr. Ray, I said, now, do you do television? Because I'm going to send your stuff to the bookers because we need to book you. Dr. Ray is Vice President and Executive Director of the Air Equity Initiative. That is the American Institutes for Research. And the Air Equity Initiative, it is a $100 million plus, folks, investment in behavioral and social science research and technical assistance to address segregation by race and place in local communities across our country. As a professor at the University of Maryland and senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, Ray regularly testifies at the federal levels, at the state levels. I know y'all have seen him on C-SPAN. And he's testifying on racial equity, policing, and criminal justice reform, as well as health policy, wealth disparities, and family policy. As the founding executive director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research, Ray helped develop a virtual reality training program for law enforcement and led implicit bias trainings with thousands of police officers, military personnel, and employees at companies as well as organizations. Ray serves on the National Artificial Intelligence Advisory Board Subcommittee on Law Enforcement, tasked with providing advice to the President of the United States, the State of Maryland's Governor Task Force on reducing and eliminating bias related to automated valuation models and alternative property valuation methods. Let me tell y'all, the data matters, okay? Also, the Legacy Renovation Scholars Committee with the National Civil Rights Museum right here in Memphis, and the Meta Global Policy Council. Ray has published over 50 books, articles, and book chapters, and over 50 op-eds. He's writing, y'all. He has written for the Washington Post, the New York Times, USA Today, Politico, Business Insider, Newsweek, NBC News, The Guardian, The Hill. You name it, he has been there. And his books include Systemic Racism in America, How Families Matter, and Race and Ethnic Relations in the 21st Century. And most recently, he was awarded an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship. Please give a warm round of applause to Dr. Rashawn Ray.
All right, everyone, give it up for Simone. Isn't she amazing? Great to have her here. It's great to see all of you all out today. I know I'm standing in between you all and lunch, and that's never a good place to be. So put on your seatbelts. But what we're going to do, I'm going to build on what we heard from the Center for Policing Equity. They do amazing work. In my role at the American Institutes for Research, I'm excited to be able to fund their work, and you all see why, because they're giving you all concrete steps, putting documents in your hands that you all can actually utilize. I definitely want to give it up to the National Civil Rights Museum. It is an honor to work with the National Civil Rights Museum, and it is just a pillar in not only our community here in Memphis, because I went to University of Memphis, so that was one of the things that wasn't said, and I'm originally from Murfreesboro, so it's always great to come home and be a part of the Legacy Renovation Scholars Committee. I also just want to give it up for University of Memphis and students, because if you saw earlier this week, that's what we do at Memphis, right? You can't come to where we are, where we go to school, and try to talk that. We would definitely run you on up out of town. And part of thinking about that is the mobilization that happens. Even though I wasn't there physically and some of my other friends and fraternity brothers weren't there physically, you can actually help mobilization even when you're not present, through your financial resources, through your advice, and then obviously when you're able to put boots on the ground, but also through the mobilization of social media. So never think that simply because we're not there physically that we can't do things. There are multiple roles that we can actually play in terms of thinking about that. As you see here, what I'm talking about today is policy solutions. And policy solutions not only at the local level, but also at the state and federal levels. And we'll kind of walk through a lot of that. Part of what I want to do, though, is I actually want to start by asking you all a question. To continue this participation, for you all showing up, not only having the powerful voices of family members, of individuals who have been slain due to gun violence and police violence, but also for you all being here and using your time to actually pop up here. So we got 2 quick questions. So what I want you to do is you can actually use the QR code that's going to pop up, as you'll see in a second. You can also, so just take your phone, you can go to that. You can also go to www.kahoot.it, that's KAHOOT.IT. And when you go there, you'll enter in that game pin. But just pull it up like you're taking a picture, zoom in on that QR code, it'll take you right there. And then what you'll do is enter in that game pin, and then it'll start to join you with a random name. That looks kind of funny. That's kind of the less important part, but we'll let all of that come in. And then I'll ask you all 2 central questions to kick us off. We've heard a lot today already, and we'll continue to hear that as we go into lunch and in the afternoon. But I really want to know what you all think, what is most pressing here. As I mentioned, going to college here, I vividly remember my freshman year, fall 1999, my college roommate, Markeith Jones, who is all high up at Bank of America now, but he's here. It's great to see him. We were just going to the mall, y'all. We were going to Oak Court Mall. We were just leaving campus, going to Oak Court Mall. We were 2 of our other friends. We get pulled over by the police. And what's fascinating is what they said and how it's going to link to the data that I'm going to actually show. When we asked them why we got pulled over, they said that they saw weed. Now, look, I don't know what y'all's background is, what y'all have done. But seeing weed is interesting. First off, we had none of that on us. In fact, what we had were green apple suckers. Y'all know the big green apple suckers that got bubble gum in it? And so we started laughing because we were like, what do you mean? Of course, this was just a ploy to pull us over. And I'm going to show you all data here in Memphis about the ways that people are pulled over. So let's go ahead and start this. I think we got enough in here. And this first question that you're being asked, all I want is one word. One word. The one word that I want from you is dealing with what is your biggest concern about policing practices in Memphis? Your biggest concern in one word. What is your biggest concern in one word? Just type that in. When you think about policing practices here in Memphis, when you think about what's happened, not just most recently with Tyree Nichols, but also historically, thinking about your own experiences. Unfortunately, as the mothers and the siblings were saying, as much as we know, we also don't know in terms of the individuals who have been impacted. So put in your answer, and we'll actually see what words populate when we talk about concern for policing practices here in this particular city of Memphis. I also know there are several other examples of individuals trying to move up, not just being in the city of Memphis, but also what is it like to go to the suburbs and have the extension of that happening in this particular city. So we can think about this particular impact. So put in this word, and it's going to populate and essentially show us a word map of what you all are thinking are your biggest concerns. And part of what we're going to do is I'm going to actually speak to this as we go along. So we have a lot of words popping up. Now, the larger the word, that means more people said it, okay? The larger the word, the more central it is, the more people came up with that. So as you see, prominent in the middle is racism. That's what people are saying is a problem here. Death, being unchecked, training, profiling, safety, of course, is coming up. And of course, there are 2 sides of that safety coin when we talk about public safety. Not only is it about police over-policing us, but it's also about us being under-resourced when it comes to public safety in our local neighborhoods, and we'll talk about that. But you all can see these words up here. Powerful words that speak to where we are. And this is a simple exercise that you can also do in your community group, in policy circles, to really get people on the same page quickly about what we should focus on. It's very clear that racism pops up to the top, and then the rest are intersections related to it. I'm going to speak directly to that. Let's go to the next question. The next question is about hope. Let's flip that. What is your biggest hope about policing practices in Memphis? You're sitting up here on a Friday morning, spending time at this convening. What do you hope comes out of this? What do you hope changes in your city? And a city that I mentioned is a part of me, that helped create me. I vividly remember being at the slave auction block in January. And if you all are part of that lineage on MLK Day, and then walking to the Lorraine Motel where the National Civil Rights Museum is located at. And I vividly remember, I'm a member of Alpha Phi fraternity, by the way, so figured I would say that. As we would be going back to campus, what I remember is after being filled up with joy and motivation and hope, we would pass by Nathan Bedford Forrest statue on the way back to campus. Now, why do I bring that up? I bring that up because 25 years ago, that monument was there, and it is no longer there today. And that is what happens when people actually come together and mobilize. So as we look at these words, fairness pops out. Reform is the biggest one. Accountability, collaboration, which we hope is happening here. Patience, proper policing, effectiveness, equity. These are the things that we hope come out of this. Isn't it interesting that some of your biggest hopes, or one of your biggest hopes, is just fairness? You just want to be treated fairly. You want to be treated like everyone else. Okay, let's go back to the PowerPoint. Put your seatbelts on, because I'm going to move in terms of thinking through how we think through this work. And I actually want to start with a powerful quote. A quote by none other than Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. A quote that is oftentimes missed in his March on Washington speech. We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. That centers us. That's that racism that you all picked up on. And where we're at now, we are in a policy window. A policy window is kind of like a match that's been lit. You know when you're trying to light a candle and you have a match, and the candle, like the wick is all the way down in one of these big Yankee candles and you kind of get burned? That's what happens when you engage in policy work and activism. And we can think throughout history, though, what's happened when people have done this. From the end of enslavement to ending convict leasing, which was simply slavery by another name, to thinking about the civil rights movement and the fight for equality when it comes to education, and of course, police brutality and dealing with guns and Me Too. Over the past decade now, I've collected some of the most rigorous and innovative research on policing. Not only do we have a data set after Michael Brown was killed of 32 million tweets there, but also ethnographic data and implicit bias trainings from over 1,200 police officers. That was part of our first study. We've now trained thousands of them in departments across the country. Also, interviews with police officers and civilians about what they think about police-community relations, and then a virtual reality program that you heard about. So I'm going to walk you through some of these data and what you need to know and put some data points when you're talking to people. What does this graphic show? Well, let me tell you what this graphic shows. This shows that black people are 3.5 times more likely than whites to be killed by police when we are not attacking and do not have a weapon. The family members up here earlier were talking about that. How do we know that? Because if you start on the top bar, black people represent 13% of the population. You go to the second bar, all of a sudden it's over 30%. Now at this point, some people are saying, oh, well, this is about black people's behavior. Well, as you heard from Eric, only about 1 to 3% of the population, the black population to be specific about it, in any year engages in violent crime. But yet our entire community becomes over-policed. These are key stats for you all to raise up. What happens on the third bar? How do we know that that is about racism? Because the third bar shows these are people that police say, these are from police reports, that police say were not attacking and did not have a weapon when they were killed by us. The bar for black people increases. That's called racism. If anything, that gap should decrease. But instead it increases. And there are different ways to think about it. The top bar for African Americans, that teal, are black men. 1 out of every 1,000 black men can expect to be killed by police in the United States. 1 out of every 1,000. So for all that you know, think about who you don't know. And it's even a higher likelihood the younger people are, as you see at the top. And not just for black folks, but also for indigenous people as well. But you can see the hierarchy there. If you are a young African-American man, the likelihood of you being killed by law enforcement is 7 times higher than it is for other groups. So, what do we know when we racialize the criminal justice system? Well, let's look at Memphis. The black population in the city of Memphis is about 65%. Black police officers represent about 58%. It's actually significantly higher than other cities. But black people are subject to police use of force 86% of the time. Now, some people might say, particularly if you watch the news in Memphis or you've been somewhere and maybe something happened with your vehicle, it got carjacked, and some people are like, well, this is what should be happening. But is it though? Let's just look at the data, because that's what I do, right? So racial disparities in police arrest in different parts of the state, from Nashville, by my hometown, of Murfreesboro to Memphis. Just look at the right pie charts. Again, that's the 86%, but we can compare that to Nashville. Now, granted, the black population in Nashville is much smaller. So the point of what you got to look at is that black people are significantly more likely to be arrested across the state. But what are they arrested for? Let's look at this. Aggravated assault. Now, what's interesting about aggravated assault is one of those outcomes that you perceive this means that people are fighting, or at the time that they are fighting someone. When instead, a lot of these individuals who are arrested for aggravated assault are arrested for resisting arrest, mostly due to possession of marijuana. That gets back to my story about the green suckers. Possession of marijuana, not necessarily planning to distribute marijuana, just possession of it. Because it's all about whether or not police can justify a police stop. And then theft is another big one, where we see these disparities. And so when we look at major cities across the United States and we look at police killings, I want you to just look at that left graph. Memphis is right in the middle, where about 5 people are killed by police during that time period from 2013 to 2019 every year. So Memphis is right in the middle of that, but you can see where some cities are completely out of whack with what's happening. Look at St. Louis, and you realize why Michael Brown was simply the catalyst that really helped spark the Black Lives Matter movement, because we know the Black Lives Matter movement really came from when Trayvon Martin was killed. But you can see these differences here across these cities. What's the big takeaway that you need to know? One narrative that we hear from law enforcement and also in the media is that there is a relationship between violent crime and police killings. In fact, there is not a relationship between those two. That is a very, very important point. Both of them are important, but they are two completely different metrics that have to be addressed in different ways. Violent crime is a problem in a lot of places, even though if you grew up in the 60s or you grew up in the 80s, violent crime today is nothing like it was then. Just let me tell you that. Even though if you like me, when I watch TV, I'm like, I can't let my kids go outside. Like it feels that way, even though that's not actually what's happening. And the crime increases that happened during COVID were related to COVID, were related to a pandemic and economic turmoil, and then we've seen that go down. I'll take questions at the end. And so what you're seeing on this graph here is the X's is the violent crime rate, and the orange squares is the police killing rate. Those two metrics are not related at all. If they were, the way that we see the police killing rate in that line, that slope with the squares, we would see the violent crime rate mapping onto that, and we don't. If you're looking for Memphis, Memphis is basically right in the middle, kind of on the left side of the middle there, in between Louisville and Dallas. But kind of less important exactly where Memphis is, the point is that when you see a person killed by police, typically that is not related to something that they've done. In fact, white people are much more likely to actually be engaging in a violent crime when they are killed by police, if they are killed by police at all. Because oftentimes they are giving a lot more discretion and they are frequently arrested without actually being killed. For black people, it's a different story. I just mentioned the violent crime rate. This is just showing you from 1990 through 2020. And even if we go into 2022 and 2023, we've seen a decrease. that the police killings aren't about violent crime. They are not mapping onto each other. Police kill over 1,000 people every single year. That is a person every 8 hours, and a black person is killed by police every 40 hours in the United States. That is not related to these metrics we think about. And how do we know it? Besides what I've told you, the other part of it, there was a large study done in New York City. Stop and frisk. Y'all know about stop and frisk. It's still going on. You have jump out boys, you got Terry stops, you got all of that. This study actually ended, at least on paper, stop and frisk in New York City. Of course, stop and frisk, it says that police, if they see someone that they think is shady, then they have the right to pull them over. Of nearly 700,000 stops, you can see the percentages on the left. Half of those people were black that they stopped, a third were Latino, 9% were white. One thing that Mayor Bloomberg said at the time, he said, well, I actually think that they should be stopping fewer white people and more black people, right? That was his statement. Now, what's interesting about New York, people actually think New York is a much blacker city than it actually is, right? So we gotta clear that part up. I know we're from the South. Sometimes we don't get up there as often, and we just have this image. What's the point, though? 56% of these stops led to frisking. Raise your hand if you ever been frisked by the police. Yeah, that is a very uncomfortable thing. Oftentimes, it's not like a TSA pat down. Like, I get patted down by TSA all the time. They say it's random. I'm like, how many times do it have to be random for it to not be random, right? So we already know what's going on there. I'm like, I got TSA pre, I got clear, I got everything. I don't even know why y'all touching me at this point. We already know what that's about, right? These 56% of stops involve frisking. The point of bringing it up, frisking is very uncomfortable. It is literally like you are being shaken down if that's never happened to you. Of 56% of those stops, what percentage do you all think led to something? Even whether a person had a weapon, had a previous criminal record, whether or not a person had drugs on them, what percentage would you say of these 56% of stops do you think led to something? Meaning police saw somebody doing something, they then decided to stop that person, then they frisked that person. What percentage do you think, how successful are police at that? Raise your hand if you think 25% of the time they get it right, 1 out of 4. What about 50%? Okay, one out of 4? What about 50%? People got confidence like that? I know I'm talking to a red crowd here. Y'all probably. What about 10%? People think 10%? Less than 5%. Yeah. And of course, y'all are probably reading this. 2% of the time. 2%. 2% of the time. But I want you all to look at the numbers below the 2%. That is beyond the frisking, the number of times force was used. Physical force was used. And what came out of this? Well, 88% of the time, nothing. 6% of the time, people were summoned, meaning given a summons, and roughly 6% of the time, they were arrested, mostly for resisting arrest. One of the things we also know is that the racial gap in police killings does not have to do with people's social class background. Y'all know they say that, right? They like, oh, if you become like, Dr. Eric Dyson and get that doctor, you won't be profiled in the same way. Yeah, it don't really happen that way. And this graph actually shows this. What I want you to look at, this is about social class. It's white and black men. The top 2 lines are black men. The bottom 2 lines, the dotted lines, are white. The red are affluent people, people who are college educated, people who have professional jobs. Now, you're probably looking at this and you're seeing that spike in the 60s and you're like, what the heck is that? That's why our civil rights leaders being killed by police. And we know that happened right here in this city as well. That's that spike. So when people talk about the leadership in the black community, where is it gone? Unfortunately, they were killed when they were trying to make it and do something about it. We got to remember, King didn't even make it to 40. Kind of blows my mind. I'm 43, so I think about that often when we think about that. And we also know that even if you aren't killed or frisked by police or beaten by police, because again, for as many people that are beaten, for many people that are killed, there are thousands of people who are beaten that we never hear about on a regular basis. And we know that when complaints go to police departments, nothing happens typically with those, unless you have a community oversight board, which we'll get to in a second. But accordingly, we know that if you live in communities where police violence is higher, And we've done some of this research. One of my colleagues at Emory, Ali Sewell, we've done a lot of these analyses showing that if you live in communities where over-policing is higher, even if you are controlling for violent crime, again, I want to be clear because those are different metrics, that we have what we call the illness spillovers of police violence. And we actually did this work highlighting the killing of Eric Garner and then the death of his daughter, Erica Garner, where what we found in our research is that men who live, not just black men, men who live in communities that are over-policed, their mental health suffers, more likely to suffer from depression and anxiety. Women's physical health suffers, more likely to suffer from diabetes, more likely to suffer from high blood pressure, and more likely to die earlier. And that is part of what happened to Erica Garner. And I've written some of this work at Brookings, as you see here. We also know that in these local communities, again, you go to the suburbs, you get out of Memphis, or maybe even in Memphis, because Memphis is starting to look different. But you go out and all of a sudden you encounter people who are trying to police you from being there. These people who have become infamous with different names. Black people just trying to go for a swim. Black people trying to study at Princeton, trying to get ready for finals. Black people in Oakland, where I did my postdoc at Berkeley, just trying to chill at Lake Marion and have a barbecue. Y'all know black people have a barbecue. They ain't bothering nobody when they just trying to barbecue, right? And then we see all these outcomes. And what do these people typically do? They call the police. Why? Because policing in the United States has been built and sustained to protect whiteness, not to be fair and equal. So we see that outcome. And we know in like Ahmaud Arbery, where we see what happens when that occurs. In some of my research is what Ben Crump has called the Ahmaud Arbery effect, because years before that happened with Ahmaud Arbery, I was doing research on physical activity in local communities. You know, you go out, look, raise your hand, any runners in here? A few? What about walkers? You just get out and walk? Okay, yeah. You just everybody's like, well, I do walk. I mean, I have to get around. I mean, that's what you're asking. All right. So raise your hand if you get out and you exercise, you walk around your community. You feel safe there. You feel comfortable there. See, y'all can't see what I see now. I see hands going down when I start asking those additional words. Because safety is relative for black people. And it's relative based on the racial composition of the neighborhood. This is why, even though we don't always, well, actually we do now have another green book, but not the historic green book that we use now. People just know where they're supposed to stop when they're traveling to and fro. Like if you're going from Memphis to Murfreesboro and you're going down 40, it's certain places you're supposed to stop and it's certain places you're not. All y'all in here know don't stop when you're going through Dixon County now. I got a story about that. I don't even have time to tell y'all about that. I might not be standing up here today if it wasn't for that incident. So what are you seeing here? I just want you to look at black men on the right. These bars are showing the racial composition in neighborhoods. Predominantly black is the left bar for each group. Racially diverse is the middle bar, and predominantly white is the right bar. So just look all the way at the top right. What you see is that black men are significantly less likely to engage in physical activity in predominantly white neighborhoods. Why is that? Because we are over-policed. But what's interesting, if you look at racially diverse neighborhoods, things are typically good for most people. That's what we aim for. Why is that problematic, though? Because there are only 2% of census tracts in the United States that have a similar percentage of Latinos, whites, Asians, and black people who have comparable levels of education and income, meaning they're equally yoked, to use that Southern religious term, right? Only 2% of census tracts. Overwhelmingly, we live in highly segregated communities. And those highly segregated communities, as the panel said earlier, leads to differential policing outcomes. You can be in a predominantly white neighborhood and encounter the same officers that you do in a predominantly black neighborhood, and your experience is completely different. And we see that playing out. So what are some of the ways we try to address this? Well, early on, nearly a decade ago now, we started to develop a virtual reality training program. You know, that was when implicit bias was hot. We thought that would change everything, right? And then we realized that the policies supersede people's minds oftentimes in terms of their behaviors. But we developed this virtual reality program, and we ended up developing it with Google, with Jigsaw to be specific. And our generation one, what we did is we got out and we developed over 90 virtual reality scenarios with police. They varied in just a whole bunch of different ways. We had suspicious person scenes, and we had pullover scenes. We varied gender, we varied race, we varied urbanicity, we varied language. And part of what we did was we went out with law enforcement and actually did this work. We got out, we figured out where they were. I could go into all the technical detail of it. It was actually really cool. That's the camera in the middle on the top left picture that you kind of see that was capturing it at the moment. You know, this is before we kind of do VR with our phones and stuff like that. But this was super cool stuff that we were doing, getting out, thinking of ways that we can provide advanced training programs for law enforcement. And so we did this development, and what we did was we started having law enforcement from around the country come to our lab at the University of Maryland, where I was the founding director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research. Dr. Longdon now heads it up. And we would have officers go through our virtual reality training. They would put on goggles. They would encounter a person in a virtual space and a domestic house scene. Say the police got called for noise, a suspicious person at a bus stop, a robbery at a gas station, a mental health call, and a pullover. And so this is just a screenshot of kind of how you see it, and you had these training modules on the right for law enforcement. When law enforcement got out, they would fill out a police report. What did we find? Well, raise your hand if you've ever taken an implicit association test that come out of Harvard. All right, a few of you. Yeah, if you haven't, you should go to you should type in implicit and Harvard, and what'll pop up, type in implicit and Harvard. A set of exercises will pop up that allow you to gauge your bias. So millions of people have taken these around the world. We gave them to law enforcement, and what we found honestly shocked me. What we found, this was a test, they looked at the relationship between race and weapons. And what we found was that officers, police officers, had a very strong association in perceiving that black people would have weapons, even when they were inanimate objects. But they basically did not carry that relationship for white people, as you see at the bottom. This graph is not a mistake. And what's important here, in talking about Tyree Nichols and those officers who murdered him, well, we did not find differences by race in terms of officers holding these views. That is important to note. And so we went further. We then looked at, and I'm not going to go into all of the statistical detail of this. The big thing you need to know is that among officers' characteristics, there are no differences. So to kind of briefly tell you how you read this, the dotted line in the middle, if you look at men and women, those two bars, if they overlap, that means men and women officers do not differ in their level of conscious racism. We can look at non-white and white. They do not differ among police officers. Why would this be? Because they are trained the exact same way. And they are in the same organizational system that leads to what we saw to George Floyd playing out, even though one of those officers was saying, should we turn him over? Should we do something different? But the way that the blue wall of silence operates, he did not act on what he was thinking and what he was saying. And it probably would have saved George Floyd's life. The other thing that we found out that was fascinating is that there is not a strong relationship between implicit bias and conscious bias. Again, that's another assumption we've made. We made the assumption that consciously racial cops, like in Louisiana that's dragging black people out like we back in Emmett Till days, that those consciously racial cops are the same cops who hold implicit bias, and we don't find that. Implicit bias and conscious racial bias, are two different metrics that have to be addressed. And they primarily have to be addressed through policy and accountability. Because one thing that Dr. Otis Johnson, who's at WashU, says oftentimes, I'm unsure if culture is reformable. And we have to be very clear about that when we talk about what law enforcement was founded for in the United States. So what do we find here? Well, probably no surprise. I just want you to look at the red bars. Across 3 of our virtual reality scenarios, the domestic house scene where somebody was called, causing noise, the store scene where there was a robbery, and a bus stop, the lower the bar means the less respect a person was given. The higher the bar means the more respect a person was given. Now, this was an algorithm. I could go into all of the cool stuff that we were doing. In short, when officers put the goggles on, we have over 1,000 responses that they receive back based on their own behavior, their tone of voice, the words they use, and how close they are to the virtual reality character in the VR. We have this device, it's called the Pearl 2, and it's kind of like Monday Morning Quarterback. You can show them the replay later of actually what they were doing. So when we would say, yeah, you know, you actually reached for your weapon when you saw this person, they're like, no, I didn't. Rewind the tape. Yeah, you actually did. And these are the kind of checks that happen, because if you're encountering a cop and a cop all of a sudden puts their hand on the side, you start getting more nervous than you did a second ago. But if that officer didn't consciously realize that he or she did that, now they're thinking you're reacting to something else. And now we have an incident that they escalated and they didn't realize that they escalated it. So when you look up here, you see the two red bars on the right and the left. And that is the less respect that black men get in encounters, right? Now, you look in the middle and you see that high red bar, you're saying, what happened in the store? Why would black men get more respect in the store scene? Well, let me tell you what you did. This is what I love about research. When the officers put on the goggles and they encounter what happens at the convenience store, they pull up in the parking lot, they come in the store, and there's a person standing behind the counter with a uniform on, like they work at 7-Eleven. So you know they work there. And in that situation, the racial difference goes away. What is that about? Well, that is about the fact that police officers perceive that person in the store to be a victim. Whereas in the house scene and the bus stop scene, it's ambiguous. And the more ambiguity, the more officers fill up what they're thinking with biases, right? Now, what that means is, the key concept, to leave you all with a social psychological term, is called subjective uncertainty. It's when there's minimal understanding in individuals infer stereotypes and potentially discriminate. It's kind of like, again, it's kind of like a bottle of water. If you have a bottle of water or even a container and you don't know what's in it, first you're going to guess what's in it based on who you're looking at, right? Then after that, then you're going to guess how much is in it. So now you've made all these assumptions about a person who you don't know based on what they look like. And officers do that every single day. Now, I should note, and in this crowd, I didn't do it at the beginning. Typically with police, I got to do it at the beginning. I got to kind of calm them down. But I come from a law enforcement and military family. My great uncle, Walter J. Gooch, was the first black chief of police of Murfreesboro. My other uncle, James Talley, was also on the police department. And I have a cousin who was in North Carolina, James's son, Tyler, who was also a cop. My grandfather served in 2 wars, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, has presidential commendations. My mom was admitted to West Point in the 1970s as a black woman. I know what this experience is like by living vicariously through them when police have to run out on Thanksgiving after my grandmother made macaroni and cheese. She don't make it with raisins, though. I'm going to tell you that now. But her macaroni and cheese is good, and her green bean casserole and crock pot corn is good, too. And my relatives who are in law enforcement now have to leave. I know what that's like. But I also know that they are trained the exact same way. And I also know that when you live in communities with people, that part of what happens when police officers oftentimes encounter white people in Germantown or Cordova compared to black people in Whitehaven is that part of what happens is that officers are more likely to live around those people in those communities. So what happens in your mind pauses for a second. And officers in their heads, they think, this could be the dude I work out at the gym. This could be the guy I see running around, or in y'all's cases, walking around the neighborhood. This could be the person who goes to church. This could be another parent at my kid's school. When they see a black person, they think this could be the criminal that I arrested the other day, even though I arrested them for something that's not even going to stick because I arrested them because I thought I saw weed. That is how we see that playing out. And this is the reason why research documents. Well, first of all, let me ask you, if I had a snake on my shoulders and I threw it into the crowd, raise your hand if you would run up out of here. Well, what about a tarantula? If I had 2 big tarantulas and I threw them, y'all out of here. Yeah, y'all are like, look, you put the deuces up. I'm out. I'm not asking any questions, right? You know, some of my students get all technical. I had a student the other day, she was like, well, what color is the snake and spider? Like, I mean, is it, and then did you do something to it? I mean, it's aggravated now because you threw it. I'm like, yes. Talk to my youngest son about all these details. Point of bringing this up is what? This just elicited a fight or flight syndrome in you. And that fight or flight syndrome is what surfaces in police officers because deep down what happens is blackness in our society has been weaponized, and weaponized to the point that whenever black people are unarmed and we are not attacking, it is still perceived that our physical bodies can cause harm to other people. And this is the reason why psychological studies show that the same physiological response that our bodies have to seeing snakes and spiders, some people have to being in close proximity to black people, particularly black men, like in an elevator. And all of us have had this feeling where that's happened. I want to touch on two other points and then talk about policy and ask you all one more question. And then I think we'll have a little time for a little Q&A. One big thing that's came up over the past few years is about defund the police. I've written about this extensively, and my article at Brookings, if you just type in defund the police, my article will probably be one of the first 5 to 10 that pop up. Over 1 million people have read this article. Why? Because I just asked one simple question. Does defund the police have merit? That's what I do as an academic. We educate people. What I know is that 9 out of 10 calls for service, meaning when a person calls 911, 9 out of 10 of those have nothing to do with violence at all. Now, they can turn violent after the fact, most definitely. And I still think that police have one of the most dangerous jobs, particularly when they're pulling people over on a traffic stop. But what's important here is 9 out of 10 have nothing to do with violent calls at all. Why is that? Well, that is because police budgets, as you'll see in a second, have ballooned so much that they are doing everything from trying to get a cat down out of a tree to going around looking for potholes. Now, look, if you like me and you don't roll down popular lies, somebody need to look for them potholes. But I'm just unsure if we want police doing that, right? The other thing we know, homicide clearance rates. Let me tell you what this means. Clearance rates means police arrested somebody. Not even that a person was charged or convicted, just that a person was arrested. About 40% of murders in the United States go unsolved. So why do we feel unsafe? Because we hear about a murder on TV, and then it's like, then we don't hear anything else about it. Because 40% of them go unsolved. 66% of rapes go unsolved. 70% of robberies, nearly 50% of aggravated assaults go uncleared every year. Now, when you read those stats, there's one way to interpret it. One way to interpret it is that, particularly coupled with the stop and frisk data I told you earlier, one way to interpret it is that, wow, police might not be that good at their job. Right? That's one way to interpret it. I mean, these are bad stats, right? But another way to interpret it, which I think is the fairer way and the more objective research-based way, is that police have so many things that they have to do that they don't have time to focus on the actual crimes that everyone wants them to solve. Sabrina Fulton, when she was up here, she said everybody wants safety in their communities. Right? This is the reason why when people poll and then survey and interview black folks, you get mixed answers, but they're similar. So if you ask people like, yeah, some of us, we want to defund the police, which simply means to reallocate funding. It doesn't mean to necessarily abolish the police, even though there are some people who think that, but it's a much smaller percentage than people think. But then when you ask people, do they want more police in their community? There are a lot of black people who say yes. And let me tell you what they're meaning. What they're actually meaning is this. They're meaning that we want the same quality of policing and public safety that we know our neighbors get down the street in a predominantly white community. And this is because, on one hand, we are over-policed. A grandmother knows that when her grandson is walking down the street, that he has a higher likelihood of being stopped by police, but she also knows that if she has a stroke or a heart attack, that they're going to come slower to her house than they are to somebody down the street. So we are simultaneously over-policed and underserved when it comes to public safety. And research documents this, that in black and Latino neighborhoods, people wait much longer for 911 to come when we actually call them. And part of that has to do with where stations are located, where hospitals are located, where response services are located. It's all about segregation in place. But part of what we also know is that federal spending on law enforcement since the early 80s has increased over 350%. 350%. Federal spending. We hadn't even got to state spending, where we see these huge increases. And when you look at these cities that are highlighted here, think about what you know that has happened there when it comes to policing. This is not by accident. Part of what my research shows is that once you start getting over 35% in terms of spending taxpayer money on law enforcement in cities, you start getting a reverse bell curve of negative policing outcomes. that have to do with empowerment, that has to do with fraternal order of police control, and it has to do with police having so much oversight and so much control and power that they don't have the ability or the resources or the personnel to actually do everything that they're supposed to do. And in the city of Memphis, what does this look like? 38%. That's y'all's money. I don't live here no more. That's y'all's money. 38%. You got to ask you, are you getting a 38% return on your taxes for the level of policing practices that happen? I can just see by the number of people in here that the answer is no. And you see how much money that is per year. But imagine if that went to social services. Imagine if that went to education. Imagine if that went to co-responder programs. And we also know that each year, this is one big thing that people know, it's my big last point, that each year most major cities, not even out of that 38% for Memphis, on top of that, they take money and put it in the budget for civilian payouts for police misconduct. $1.25 million in the city of Memphis. That Tyree Nichols settlement going to be a whole lot more than that. So on top of that, you have that money coming out of your taxes that does not come out the police budget. What does that mean? That means no accountability. Police have a very high level of internal accountability, what we call internal organizational accountability. So when you talk to cops, they say things like, yeah, there are just things we can't do. We get in trouble for everything, right? Or we need more training. We need more bodies. You know what it is? Because their budget keeps getting bigger and people aren't committing to the profession like they used to. And then the other thing is that on top of that, when you have this money being spent, they aren't accountable to the public because this money does not come out of their budget. They could care less, actually, about these settlements. Because over 90% of the time, of those 1,000 people every year that are killed by police, over 95% of cops are never charged. And of the cops that are charged, over 90% are never convicted. So I want y'all to keep that in mind when we hear these stories of cops being convicted. That is not the norm in no way. And in fact, the limelight actually draws more attention to it. That's a good thing. So we got to keep applying that pressure. So when we look at Memphis and misconduct settlements, there is a way that Memphis actually and the state suppresses this. And this is related to these Tyree Nichols acts that we were just hearing about that's going through the state house now, where the state is trying to say that what they do at the local level can't happen at the state level. Like that is one of the biggest ploys, and that is one of the things that we have to mobilize to think about to fight back. But when you look at this, you look at the budgeted and then you look at the actual. In most years, up until 2018, the actual was much higher than the budgeted for civilian payouts for police misconduct. What happened? Where the state in the state of Tennessee changed some little law that kind of has to do with a Gardner case from 1985 that if you ask police, they'll talk about that like it's platinum. And part of thinking about what this says is that police have the right to do certain things, but in the state of Tennessee, they put in a clause into recent legislation that says that police actually can be liable, but then they can't be liable because they actually work for the city. Now, y'all heard that right. It doesn't make sense. But what makes sense is that it's hard to then sue the city because you also have to sue the cops who can't be liable, right? So we see that playing out. And in cities like Chicago, we're talking about much larger sums. I mean, we're talking about $225 million in settlements that they pay out over a certain period of time. And we know that when we talk about these settlement amounts, we're talking about huge amounts. One big one that I don't have time to get into, but I know y'all look it up. Corinne Gaines in Baltimore, look up her case. Look at that amount, $32 million. You got to ask yourself, raise your hand if y'all heard of Corinne Gaines before. Yeah, for this to be this crowd, not enough hands went up, right? So look at that. And of course, we can think about these settlements all across the country that have been played out that come from taxpayer money. On top of the budgets, we see this money coming out of what's going on all across the country, paid out for civilian payouts for police misconduct. And I want to be very clear about this. One thing that my research has shown is that there are people, probably not people, it's probably people who are not in this room, are very comfortable with their tax money going to these civilian settlements because it actually makes them feel safer, not us. Now, the other thing that we heard from the Center for Policing Equity was talking about mental health co-responder programs. New Jersey is one of the best examples of this. They've taken it statewide. When I was at Brookings last year, I evaluated this program. You can see these metrics here. Arrests completely go down. Use of force goes down. Racial differences go down. Now, in the state, they're transforming it in different ways. They're allowing communities to decide what happens. But these programs really, really work. But we also got to talk about police officers' own mental health. There's a large study, and I've analyzed some of this data, showing that police officers, 80% of them suffer from chronic stress, recurring memory loss, family relationship problems. They're easily angered, sleep problems. They have a difficult job. 1 out of 6 have thoughts of suicide, and roughly 1 out of 6 report substance abuse. Hurt people hurt people. On top of being racist structurally, they also hurt people. 90% of them never seek help. That can be a policy change that happens to require law enforcement to get mental health counseling. We heard that from Tyre Nichols' mom, where she was saying that. 90% of them never seek help. But one thing I know from doing research with Raleigh PD is that when it's mandatory, let me tell you what happens when things are mandatory. They become normalized. Everyone has to do it. It reduces the stigma. Now a police officer doesn't have to worry about not getting put on a specialty unit because people think they're not fit mentally. Instead, everyone has to go through it now. This can be required here for them to go through that. And we know these state bills that we heard about earlier in Tyre Nichols' name, requiring traffic stop data to be published. Look, y'all, this is your money. All of these data should be public. It should not be a question. But the big elephant that we haven't talked enough about today is the power of the Fraternal Order of Police. And I want to make this point. Police chiefs come and go. They're oftentimes appointed by mayors or county executives. The Fraternal Order of Police president is elected by cops. And that person is oftentimes much more powerful than the chief of police that we see on TV every day. You need to follow that person and figure out what's up with them and maintain some accountability there. So what are some things that we can do? Let me run through these, and then I got one more question for you all. The first big thing, and I've talked a lot about police budgets and police spending. What we need is police officer insurance, liability insurance, and police department insurance. You can't be a plumber, a truck driver, or electrician without insurance. But you can be a cop with a gun that comes straight out of school, straight out of high school, and get a gun and go shoot somebody in our community. Something's wrong with that. But in the state of Colorado, and I think they're doing some of the most advanced work, is that they now have legislation that requires officers to carry liability insurance. Not for the whole thing, but for a percentage so that they have skin in the game. But we also got to have the police department to have insurance too. And one thing my research has shown is that when that happens, because actually a lot of small police departments actually do have insurance, because they're not large enough to fund it themselves. That money, because y'all are funding it, actually. Smaller departments have municipal risk pools. And when that happens, the insurance hits them up and says, y'all got to let that officer go. They're causing too many problems. They're causing us too much money. Or you're going to lose your entire insurance policy for your entire city, and not just your city, but these other 10 or 20 cities that are in your same pool. We also need a bad apples list and a good apples protections. See, the blue wall of silence exists not because officers just want to be loyal to it, but because there are real consequences for breaking it. We also need to think about reallocating funding. I talked about that. Civilian representation on the Police Misconduct Board. This is also kind of wrapped up with the Tyre Nichols legislation in the state, because even though we can look to Denver and some of the things that they've done, but we can also look just down the street to Nashville at their Community Oversight Board, which is really powerful, ran by Jill Fitchard, who's a former police officer from D.C. But part of what they've doing in Nashville, they had community representation on the Police Misconduct Board. The state recently banned that last year. That is something that needs to be reversed to bring back. You know why they banned it? Because we started getting accountability. See, sometimes it's just about doing what we were already doing. So it's not just about the Community Oversight Board. It's about having votes, and it's about having access to data before the police department makes decisions. I talked about the other ones. I think mental health counseling for cops. I also think requiring police officers to live in a particular space. And I think that can be subsidized. Housing subsidies for down payments on homes, saying that all new cops have to live within a particular geographic location. That will get them to experiencing life with us. Instead of just coming to police us, they start to treat us like other people. So I have one last question for you. And this last question, as I get ready to close, is about what do you all think is the central policy that we should do? So if you still have this up, pull this up, and it's just going to give you this question, and then I'm done. Is what do you all think should be the focus for reform? See, this police insurance model is really starting to take off. Buffalo, Colorado, Maryland. I helped with the Maryland Police Accountability Act, which is the most progressive legislation at the state level that we've seen. Why are we able to do that? Because Maryland has pretty much the most progressive state house in terms of black elected officials. And this was even before Wes Moore got elected. This was actually under Hogan, right, who's a Republican governor. So we could think about these particular changes and what needs to happen and really being specific about what you all want to let have happen in your city, because this is your money that's being used to actually over-police you. So when we think about Breonna Taylor, her as an EMT, her own money was used to pay her family for her killing in her own house, and the drywall in between her apartment and her neighbors got more justice than she did. That is the way our system operates. And then we wonder why there's no accountability for this. So this is the last question as this clock runs down, just so that everyone is clear as we move forward throughout the day, is what is the hierarchy that you all as stakeholders here want to see for what policy should be pushed locally and at the state level, in addition to the other ones that we've talked about. Yeah, I figured that. I love when I talk about police insurance. It just transforms how we think about it, right? Police insurance, the money. Follow the dollars. Don't follow just the individual actors. It's just one person. Follow the dollars and transform where your money's going, and you transform the accountability structure. And when you do that, you start to see a change in the way people treat you in your own community. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Dr. Rashawn Ray. Thank all of you for this first half of this wonderful symposium. Please, by show of hands, have you had a wonderful time thus far? A lot of information, you've received a lot of information. We've had the opportunity to hear from impacted family members, and then we had the chance to hear from the Center for Policing Equity on Public Safety, and then Dr. Rashawn Ray as it relates to policy. So now we're about to transition over to lunch, and over in Ballroom A and B, we're gonna have about a 30-minute break. We would like for you to be in your seats, get your food. We have box lunches, really nice box lunches, and then we will start the program in A and B at 12:45. Thank you so very much for being here.